but I have a lot of films in me. Trying to get here.
I'm Karen Molinas, and I'm on the board of the Maryland Native Plant Society. I am one of the founding members of the society. The society was founded in 1991 with the mission to preserve native plants and their habitats. And so we do education, research, and conservation efforts in that respect. And so I'm Karen Molinas. I live currently in Charles County. I moved there 2 years ago. For almost 30 years I lived in North Beach in Calvert County, and then prior to that in Tacoma Park. So you'll be hearing a little bit from my personal growth in this way. I will let you know that as I was pulling this together, like 10 hours worth of slides, I was like, I had to really cut it down. So I'm going to focus on this ecological perspective. So for today, I'm really excited to be kicking off this day-long series of workshops, lectures on native plants and native plant gardening. And I really believe that since the speakers following me are really going to focus on like the nitty-gritty of the plants and gardening, that I'm going to give a sort of a more broad overview so that you can then put into place some of the details that they provide you. So I'll be giving some information about the plants to include in your garden, but mostly about sort of the ecological aspects of your garden. So when you are thinking about gardening, you kind of have to think about your property, your lifestyle, your desires. When I moved into the house in Tacoma Park, I was deeply involved with the Native Plant Society. I was learning plant identification, really involved in understanding wild areas and natural habitats, educating people about wild areas and natural areas. So when I finally purchased my first house, it was not like the one on the bottom left. My left, your left, yeah. It was like a tiny little Tacoma Park yard, like maybe 25 feet by 50 feet. I mean, it was tiny, but it was basically a lawn. And I wasn't really interested in a lawn. I didn't have a dog to have to run around. I didn't have kids who needed a place to play. So my thought was to have something like the upper right. That's a photograph from Ladue Gardens, and if you haven't been up there, up in like Harford County, it's got some great ideas for landscape design. I thought, oh, it would be great to have a place to walk through the yard, but the edges of the beautiful gardens and the native plants, with the goal that I really wanted to have a really wild native property. So probably like a lot of you, I started with the plants I liked the most. What were my favorite plants? And for me, it's columbine is my absolute favorite plant in the whole entire world. So we had a columbine everywhere. We got a free red bud at a plant, tree giveaway. That was great. And so, part of it is that's how you start, like things that you really like, kind of in that old-fashioned garden model of, structure and shape and size and color and aesthetics. But soon I realized that my real goal was I really wanted to create a native habitat in my little tiny Tacoma Park yard. We were on a residential street, but we were very close to a very small little woods. So I thought, wouldn't it be cool if I could have a small garden? So one of the things is looking at why am I gardening? Why am I putting down native plants? And recently, this Conservation Landscape Council has come through with looking at the conservation perspective of gardening. And so I was in the Tacoma Park house for maybe 5 years, and that's when we moved to North Beach, and this is my North Beach house. So you'll see a lot of pictures of my North Beach house because we were there for 30 years, and I really developed the garden there. My house right now in near Gallant Green, I'm working on. So come back in about 3 or 4 years, and I'll have some great pictures of before and after. Oh, speaking of before and after, in Tacoma Park, pre-digital era, I have these little photo albums that I created of my development of the native garden. So I'll have this out on the table over here with all of my stuff if you're interested in seeing what I did with that tiny little yard. So these are really awesome concepts. And the challenge I found is, what do I do? Right? Isn't that your question? If I tell you, you know, have them function efficiently, you're like, oh, okay. And even like the second one of use locally native plants. Well, how many of you know how many locally native plants there are? Well, I'll let you know, this is the book I use. Okay? So which ones are you going to choose? Should you just like randomly point and pick? It's a big decision. There's a lot of choices. And of course, the other choice is what is available. So we're fortunate that more places are being involved in so you can select native plants. So the question is, how do you actually achieve these goals? So, what was that?
Could you read the bottom one?
The bottom one says, is managed to conserve energy, reduce waste, and eliminate or minimize the use of pesticides and fertilizers. And I have tried in my slides to keep the text up high because I know that's a problem. But, okay, so, but just stepping back a little bit, when we talk about ecological gardening, ecological concepts and systems, we're talking about 4 kind of connected, balanced aspects. And I actually do have a pointer. So, so when you're looking at your garden, you know, how can you help deal with air quality, you know, water runoff, erosion? Is that a problem? Water runoff and erosion a big deal? Yeah, so that's a role that your garden can play, is helping with that. With supporting is looking at all the cycles of nature, nutrient cycling. So that's one of the ways that if you've heard about the leaves, that is nutrient cycling. That's allowing all the energy that trees took up in the year, they drop them down, and then the leaves can get back in the soil that can then start the cycle again. So leave the leaves is an important cycling. Provisioning is all the food. If you've got vegetable gardening, you know, they're not necessarily native plants, but a lot of the ecological concepts help make a very dynamic garden. And of course, the cultural, and that's where we come. What do we like? What looks nice? What will your neighbors tolerate? Right? So when we're looking at ecological gardening, we're trying to find that balance between all of those aspects. And traditional gardening has almost always focused on the cultural. Is it pretty? Is it easy to take care of? What does that mean for St. Mary's County? First is take a look at what St. Mary's County is like. What do you notice in the county, if you can see it without the glare? You see green. Green means forest. Do you see there's the tan areas? Those are open areas. Are they meadows? Are they yards? And of course you've got the rivers, the waterways. So St. Mary's County is dominated by forests. The east coast of Maryland, and the east coast of the U.S. is dominated by forests. That is our dominant habitat, forests. So when you zoom in a little bit closer to where the library is, you'll see that, yes, the forest is at the bottom. It's called McIntosh Run? Macintosh, thank you. So I'm one who can't, my last name, how many people butcher that, right? So I'm allowed to butcher somebody else's name. And then you can see all these light-colored areas are all developed or farm fields. If you really look closely, there's very few natural open areas here. They're all man-made, farm fields or developments. And so when taken into consideration, our native ecosystems really are always under threat. And we know one of the biggest threats is development, habitat destruction. Invasive species are also a big, they really influence the quality and diversity of our native ecosystems, so that's something to be concerned about. Deer, how many of you have deer problems with your yard? Yeah, for 30 years I lived in a deer-free zone, so I could do some awesome stuff in my yard. I now have a nice little herd of 20 that seem to freak at my yard, so I'm in that challenge of what do I do from native plants and deer. And then climate change is going to be something that we all have to address. And so the question is, you as a nice little individual and a homeowner, what can you do about these threats? One is you can be an activist. You can work with organizations that are working on land preservation or climate change actions. But it's probably more efficient to do the classic think globally, act locally. And so you're looking at your yard, that is where you can make the biggest difference in terms of non-native species. Okay, this is my just obligatory slide about non-native species. If you want a talk on non-native species, I have a whole hour-long presentation about non-natives. But the non-native species, they're the ones that did not evolve in this area. That they generally were brought here due to human influences. Okay. That's, I should say, European colonist human influence, because there are some really amazing Native American stories of plants coming from Mexico, Central America, up into this area. And one of the major ones is corn. Corn is a plant that has been brought up by humans. Now, it's a non-native plant, but is it invasive? No, because invasive means that the non-native plant is able to reproduce on their own in a natural, without human intervention, and that it reproduces so efficiently and effectively that outcompetes native plants. And I'm talking about plants right now, but is any organism. And by outcompeting them, it really degrades the biodiversity and the quality of the habitat. And invasive species also can have an economic impact, so human impact as well as an ecological impact. So there's this book. It's currently in the next printing, which hopefully will be available in the next month. I have my last supply of the current issue over there, so the first 10 people get it. I also have the Chesapeake Fish and Wildlife Service plants for native landscapes. Again, I have about 10 of those, so just take one or the other, just so that everybody has an option. But yeah, that's, like I said, I could go on forever about that. So your plant choice does matter in terms of looking at your land management, okay? So, so this is my North Beach yard. Okay, so the one on the right over there is that one. You guys are probably having a hard time really seeing that, but so your plant choice does matter. And as I mentioned, what plant choice? Right? What plant choice? By choosing the right plants, you can actually make that difference by imagining that your yard is an ecological piece of the puzzle of the bigger picture. And that by making the right choices, you actually can have a wildlife preserve in your backyard, regardless of your size. My North Beach house, this lot was 50 by 150 feet, but it also had a house and a garage on it. So we're talking about a very restricted property. So it's not, you don't even need to have acres. You know, any small spot can really make a difference. And so one of the first things that everybody wants to do, well, we'll garden for wildlife, right? We want the birds and the bees and the butterflies, right? So all kinds of awesome plants out there that are available to attract wildlife. And one of the things that's been shifting is that role of the plants and your garden as forming that function. And Doug Tallamy, and I'm sure everybody, all the speakers today will be mentioning Doug Tallamy at least once in their talk, because he is sort of the guru of the time of the day, talking about how we can make a difference in preserving ecosystems and making our connection to the natural world much more effective in providing for biodiversity and all the ecological services. So his quote, which I really liked, was that, you know, in the past, our gardens were just asked to be pretty, right? Now we're asking them for a whole lot more, right? What does he have here? That we've got to support life, sequester carbon, that's our climate change impact, feed pollinators, and manage water. So we're asking these gardens to do a lot. So, you know, again, our plant choices are going to help us address those different components. And so choosing natives is the first obvious answer. And that's because they have evolved in this area. They have the adaptations for the soil we have, for the rainfall, for the climate, for the weird weathers that we have. So they're really, and they have the associated wildlife that is also co-evolved with the plants. So they're really fundamental when we look at this pyramid, is that plants really are the foundation of making sure that you have those four components. And that's because when you think about a food chain, the food pyramid of ecology, plants are the foundation, okay? That you need the plants in order to support anything above it. The plants are the food. Now, remember, we're talking about St. Mary's terrestrial systems. I'm sure you can find deep seawater vents that violate all what I'm going to say, but we're not in the deep sea, right? But for plants, they really are what's driving everything else in our ecosystem, okay? And when you think of your pyramid, the wider, the deeper, the broader this base, the more above it can be supported. And so that's where we get this amazing biodiversity that exists in the Mid-Atlantic region, is because the climate and the soil conditions, the moisture, that supports a huge diversity of plants. And that's why we have this. You know? That's why we have this volume of plants of the area, because it's such a perfect growing place. And so the more in your garden you can think about the diversity and the abundance of plants, the more you'll be supporting above, okay? And the other is, which is sort of a new concept for some people, is you are choosing plants to get eaten, okay? Your plants will get eaten. Is that a bad thing? Not if you're feeding your native wildlife, okay? It might be frustrating if all you're feeding are deer and woodchucks and rabbits, but you know, they are part of our native ecosystem. But really, the majority of what's eating the plants are the insects. Okay, that's our main herbivore. So when you're looking at ecological gardening, it's the insects that we are trying to attract. And the plants have been co-evolving with insects for millions of years. I have a whole other talk about the evolution of plants and insects, so like I said, each of my slides could probably be another hour of talks. But the two things that we'll talk about with insects for native plant gardening is that the insects are critical in pollination, and pollination is critical in reproduction of the plants. And so there's this give and take. I think I have another picture that I'll talk about the give and take of the plants and the animals. But of all of our plants, 80% of them are pollinated by animals. And again, in this area, those animals are insects. We do not have any plants in this area that are pollinated by bats. Our bats are all insectivores. The hummingbirds might do some pollinating, but for the most part, it's insects. And then, of course, they are the critical link in the food chain. Okay, that they are feeding the insects are really primary foods for the birds in the region. And Doug Tallamy has really made this point of studying the caterpillars of the lepidopterans, butterflies, moths, and skippers. Why? I think it's probably because they really are the dominant leaf eaters, or caterpillars. And so there could probably be other insects to talk about, but we're from this point on, we're pretty much going to talk about, well, not this point on, but for this section, talking about caterpillars of butterflies and moths. We like caterpillars because we get to see beautiful moths like this Luna moth and the butterflies. Oh, I was going to show you this one. So, and of course, right, the monarch. Everybody, how many people want to have monarchs in their yard, right? Yep. That definitely was one of my first wildlife gardening was to focus on monarchs. And other than this pupa, those are pictures of monarchs in my yard, my garden. So just a refresher that I've been talking about the caterpillars. But we like these guys. We like to see the butterflies feeding on the flowers. And so you have the adults, and the adults are pretty generalist when it comes to what they will eat. Most of them are nectar feeders, so any flower that has nectar. We have a few that eat feed off of rotting logs, tree sap, dead stuff. But they're not like, it doesn't have to be like a dead rabbit. It could be anything that's dead they'll eat. So they're fairly generalist as adults, but when it's time to lay their egg, that's when they get really specific. They have to, in laying the eggs, they need the very specific one species, maybe one genus, one group of very limited number of plants to lay their eggs, because their caterpillar, their young, will only eat those leaves. And the caterpillar's job to eat. They eat, and then they poop, and then they eat and poop, eat and poop. So that is their job, to eat. So they eventually pupate, where then they transform into the adult. And the adults, most of them really don't eat a whole lot other than to make sure they have enough energy and protein to reproduce. And pretty much once they successfully reproduce, they pass on. So the caterpillars really are that energy machine. So again, back to our foundation of our food web. We love to see hawks and birds, right, our little chickadees. Well, Doug Tallamy did do, well, maybe it wasn't Doug Tallamy, I have to remember who did it. There was a study looking at chickadees. He spoke about it in one of his recent talks, where people studied the chickadees to watch how frequently they came back and forth to their nest and what they were bringing in. And they found that one pair of chickadees fed their young almost between 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars to raise one clutch of chicks. So that's one pair or one clutch. That's a lot of caterpillars, isn't it? To have that number of caterpillars, you need a huge number of plants. And your gardens and your landscapes are going to be really fundamental in making sure that those caterpillars are there. So it's, those caterpillars are like the driving force of so much, and they are dependent on the plants you select. So again, we have the threats. Sure, you could all predict this. You got pesticides, so please don't use pesticides in your garden. You know, be very selective. If you do have to use any pesticide or herbicide, make sure you're using it as in little as possible, exactly how you need it. There was an amazing article done about one of the pesticides done for like a cutworth, one of the underground worms that's a real problem. And they found that most people were putting this stuff on the ground at the wrong time of year, that it wasn't killing the worms. And so make sure you really understand what you're doing when you're using pesticides. Habitat destruction, well, please, you know, be an activist. But light pollution is something that you can actually do something about, okay? And again, another hour-long talk about light pollution. But basically, how many of you have outside lights that are on all night long? Do you have a street light outside your house? Do you have driveway lights? Do you have a porch light? Do you have, you know, Christmas lights? You know, fortunately, Christmas happens in a time when insects aren't really active, so they're okay. But I have a neighbor who's got a spotlight on all night long. Another neighbor has porch lights on all night long. We have tiny little solar things right along our driveway. We have 4 of them, just so that when somebody's leaving, they don't like run off into the ditch. But so you can make choices so that your lighting really doesn't influence those night-flying insects. So again, there's that's a whole nother talk. But thinking about your outdoor lighting, having motion sensor lights rather than all on, the type of light that you use can make a difference. So, but for how many of you have ever heard this concept of the Keystone Species? Okay. Again, this is something Doug Tallamy is really touting. He's kind of figured out Keystone Species is an old ecological concept. It basically means that the species that holds the ecosystem together, just like the keystone in an arch, is what makes sure that that arch doesn't fall down. I don't know anything about how that works, but it does. If anybody's a building person, they might know more. But this keystone means that if you have keystone species, that if that species is not there, the rest of the ecosystem will crumble. And so, as I said, this is something, you know, I have a degree in zoology, and that's one of the fundamental things we talked about, you know, in the 80s. So I'm sure there are people who went to school earlier than that, but I work with a lot of people who weren't even, you know, weren't even born then, and they're like, the 80s? That's so last century. But so it's not a new concept, but it's a new concept in looking at it from a gardening perspective. Okay, so it's looking at these species that form the backbone of local ecosystems, particularly in terms of producing the food that fuels insects. So when you're looking in your garden in the keystone species, that's what you're trying to consider. And poor guy's trying to follow me around as I walk, right? So I like to think of the garden as like building a house. You've got the vision, like you know exactly what you want. You've got that luxury bath and the gourmet kitchen and that comfortable bedroom suite. So you can just plop it all down and it's done in the next day, right? No. You've got this whole process. So I know it's down low. Sorry about that. It'll show up higher in another slide. But what I'm doing is I'm working on the first couple steps to lay the foundation of what you'll need to do in order to have an ecologically functioning landscape. And one of the steps in building the house is you've got to have the frame. You have to have the framing up. Okay? So keystone species are these framers that is going to support your whole house. If you don't have enough framing, what's going to happen to your house? It'll probably collapse. You don't have them strong enough, they're not the right width, they don't support the size of your upper stories. So this is what the keystone species are. So think of them like that framing of a house. And so for keystone species from a garden, Doug Tallamy and his team at University of Delaware have been working on this for a while. And they basically come into two types. And we have the host plants for caterpillars, which I've been sort of talking about. And we'll also get into this pollen for specialist bees. So we'll get into that as well. And one thing that's, that the studies he's done is they really are only looking at genus level. So it's really hard to say that this exact species, so if you're talking about an oak tree, we have 22 species of oaks in the area. So it's hard to say how many does the willow oak feed. But when you look at oaks in general, they're going to be supporting that. And maybe there'll be some graduate students in the future who will look at species specifics. But I think doing genus level is pretty good because it also gives you opportunities to look at your native and local flora to say what oaks are native. Because if they're native, they're probably supporting a good number of caterpillars. And so the other is the genera or our keystone species only in their native range. So you might find a really awesome tropical plant that down in the tropics supports. Or actually, I was just listening to a podcast yesterday about the Pacific Northwest and the one of the redwoods, about the ecosystems that exist up in the tops of these redwood trees. It's just absolutely fascinating. Well, if I plant a redwood here, it's not going to have that same ecosystem because it's in the wrong place. So the genera are only keystone species in the place where they occur. So that's why it's important to look at your local flora to determine of the genera, which species do I want. So, I'm behind on my notes. I got to make sure I do ramble, and I change my talk like every 5 minutes, so I want to make sure I'm staying where I'm trying to go. Okay, the caterpillar. So here is, everybody should probably recognize that tiger swallowtail. Tiger because it's yellow and black. It's not a monarch. Do you know how many people misidentify that as a monarch? That is a tiger swallowtail, okay? This is its caterpillar, one of its two morphs. It's got a green morph and a brown morph. But that's its caterpillar. And the tiger swallowtail caterpillar is not super specific. It doesn't require just one species. It can feed on a wide range of plants, including black cherry and tulip tree. It can also do sassafras and I can't remember the other one now, but you only need to know those two. So when you think about these keystone species and how many insects that they support, the tulip tree, which actually appears to be its preferred host, Only support, sorry it's down real low, 21 species, that genera, only 21 species of caterpillars have been found to feed on that tree. 21 is still a lot. But when you compare it to black cherry, the Prunus genus, 340, or recently I think I read 400 and something, hundreds of different species of caterpillars feed on black cherry. That has a little bit to do with the age. Tulip trees are an ancient genera. And so when that plant was evolving, was likely prior to the big insect evolution. So that probably was not driven by needing to have the insects as really supporting it, or it depended on now extinct insects, which is something, if you've got mock orange, that's one that is a plant, required mammoths for spreading it. And, oh, they're not around anymore, but the plant's still around. They're just waiting. Come on, there's got to be a mammoth out there somewhere. So here, this is one of those things, both plants are fine to have in your garden. But if you had to make a choice today on which one would you want, going with the cherry gives you a lot more diversity. And if you remember that caterpillars are like the currency of the ecosystem, okay? The more caterpillars you have, the more stuff you can buy ecologically, the more diversity you have above that. So, like I said, neither one of those are a bad choice, but there's one that's easier. Oaks are if you can plant an oak, plant an oak. Okay. Our habitats in this area, if you go walking, I was thinking about how I was doing this talk, and it's like, if you threw a stick in the woods, I was like, wait, if you pick up that stick and you look at it, it's almost always going to be an oak. Okay. If you then throw it, you will likely hit an oak tree. The diversity of oaks is incredible, and that is our dominant forest type, is some sort of oak. It's often an oak hickory, but it can be an oak pine, and that's because with all the different species, the 22 species of oaks, that they can sort of mix and match depending on what the environment is like. So I've got the southern red oak. That is sort of the generalist. It will pretty much grow in any habitat here in southern Maryland. The post oak, which is one of my favorites to find, that likes to be right on the edges of woods. It's a short, small tree. It's not like the 75, 80 foot. It'd probably be like 40 feet tall. So it's a smaller oak. So if you have a smaller yard, maybe try and find the post oak. And then you've got, which is my other one over here, the chestnut oak. Those are for if you've got like a drier, like up on a ridge. They like the drier habitats. So, like I said, looking at your yard, you will find an oak that will be suitable for that. And if all else fails, the southern red oak is sort of a jack of all trades oaks for this area. So this is one of those ones where if you had to just plant one, plant an oak tree. And I also bet if you have a neighborhood forest in the area, or you're near a park, you also have oak trees there. So if your yard can't accommodate an oak, see if you can help make sure that your local areas have oaks. Okay. The other top-notch ones to choose, as I mentioned, the cherry. Those are great because now we're talking about the native cherries. So if you have your Japanese flowering cherry, it's probably not as effective as a native cherry. The maples are great, especially if you have wetter areas. They like to, they naturally, they're facultative wetland plants, so that they generally grow in wetlands, but they can grow in uplands as well. But they're really amazing if you can just put one maple tree. The hickories are really also amazing, and like I said, a lot of our forests are oak hickory. So that's our sort of co-dominant. And then pine trees, because people do like the pines. They give the evergreen a little screening to your neighbors, but they are really good. 200 species of caterpillars feed off of those. So if you can choose a native pine, which in this area tends to be loblolly or Virginia pine. Pitch pine is one of those questionable ones. Is it here or not? You'll be doing a good thing for these caterpillars. So,
are those species you got listed in Maryland alone, or is that not alone? But are those Maryland number of species, or is that
this is
America?
That's a good question. I'd have to double check to see. I think it's northeast. I think it's like the east coast. I don't. Because he was from Delaware, I don't think he went too far. So, yeah, so again, does your black cherry actually feed 340 species? It's hard to say, but still, even if you did a fraction of that, it's still a nice number. And here, our Prunus, our native Prunus is black cherry and Virginia cherry. Those are our two natives. So if you plant black cherry, likely it's getting a lot of those. We do have also like beach plum, which is an endangered species. If you're on a beach, you might have it there, but Virginia and black cherry are going to be the two. So again, you go from this, say let's put a Prunus, and you look, oh wait, there's like only a few species to worry about. Good, that's easy to narrow down which ones I might put. And then you boil down to what's available in the trade. Black cherry is very easily accessible. It's a beautiful tree. Some people do complain it's kind of messy. Yeah. But then I'm like, wait a second, what is your concept of a garden? You know? So it's changing your mindset. So, and I know that you guys better keep me on track to make sure. So now you've put up the framing, and now it's time to enclose it, so that you can actually at least be in there and not get blasted by rain or snow. And that's where your next plant choices are going to come. And this is where you want to plant for the pollen specialists, okay? And that's because even though we think of flowers for their nectar, and that certainly provides a lot of energy, it's the pollen that supports reproduction. And just like with the caterpillars are why we have butterflies. If you want the pollinators, you need to have their babies, okay? So you want to be supporting reproduction. So the nectar makes sure the adults have the energy, but the pollen is fed to the larvae of these specialists. Make sure, I wanted to, yeah, okay. So just a quick refresher on, what happened there? There. Quick refresher on pollination. Sex and gluttony is all the natural world's all about, right? So pollination is plant sex, okay? Feeding larvae and getting enough energy for reproduction is bee sex. And so the goal is that the flower wants its pollen to go from one flower to the other, so you can have cross-pollination. And somehow it has to convince its pollinator to go there. So it'll often do that through availability of nectar, a scent, a color, a shape, something that attracts the pollinator to it. And as the pollinator is feeding on the nectar, it also collects pollen. And because it's been collecting pollen, it's sort of co-evolved. There's been sort of like an arms race between plants and insects for millions of years. So now that since the bee has collected pollen, it's going to put it to use, and that's where it will sequester some of it so it can take it to its larva. But when it goes to the next flower, some of that pollen gets deposited. And so this pollination is a very mutual relationship between the flowers and the bees, so that both can successfully reproduce. And so, as I mentioned, they've been co-evolving. So here are just a couple of the different native species of bees. You can see that they're not necessarily on native to here because it depends on where I can get my photo sometimes. But I thought this was great to see all these different bees just covered with pollen. And you know, the plant doesn't need all that pollen to get pollinated, and so that's why the bees have, the plants are making sure the bees have something they can benefit from to keep them coming back time after time. And when we talk about bees, again, the question like why caterpillars, why bees? And part of it, we've got 400 species in Maryland. They are primarily pollen feeders for their larvae. There's a few that will feed their larvae like insects and stuff, but like the majority of them are dependent on pollen. And with bees, they can go as small as a pencil point all the way up to our big old giant, whatever kind of bee that is. Okay? because here's my bee book. Here's my bee book. So there is a really awesome book about bees, Sam Droege. And if you have not heard one of Sam Droge's talks about bees, he's definitely somebody to worth finding. One of his recordings on online. The Plant Society has one of his talks, but it wasn't about bees, he got something else, I think. But he's an awesome speaker, so I would recommend if you're looking for a speaker, contact Sam Droege. He's just up in Prince George's County. So, okay. And so, as I mentioned before, the flowers and the bees are coordinating based off of when they're blooming. Doesn't help if your bee is not active when you're blooming. So you need to coordinate that and all the shapes. And so this, by selecting the plants for these pollen specialists, you'll be sort of putting up that next framework. And goldenrods are the winner. Goldenrods, again, we've got, oh, I forgot to look up how many species of goldenrods. Lots of species of goldenrods. Okay. And they bloom, most of them are summer and fall bloomers, but we have a few springtime bloomers. So these are, and the springtime bloomers actually are more woodland, more shaded areas. So this is one where there are specialist bees who only feed on Solidago. And these are a couple of the types of bees that really only feed on the goldenrods. So if you need to make choices, choose goldenrods. Make sure you have that in your garden. And again, people who are afraid of their hay fever, ragweed, I mean, goldenrod is not the source of your allergy. Okay? The source of your allergy is something that's a windborne, whether it's pine trees, it could be grass, ragweed. Well, if we're talking about flowers to attract pollinating insects, that pollen is heavy and sticky and designed to be transported by the insect. So if you're planting pollen specialist plants, they are not creating allergies. And most of our, and then we have sunflowers and all the things in the form of aster genus. They're also really great. I know that last year, the tiny little field had heath aster. It was like full of all kinds of insects. I don't know if you have that. It's a tiny little white aster that just, it's a great plant. But most of our pollen specialists are these open sunny habitats, which is great if you're a yard that doesn't have any trees. But as we know, forests are dominant, right? So this will be great. You know, you've got lots of choices for summer and fall. But we have to remember that in our forests, our dominant habitat, there's going to be pollinators, pollen specialists out in these forests. And so thinking about those shade-loving plants. And that's where you can look at a lot of our spring flowers, like our toothworts and things. So these have very specialized bees that will feed on them. Spring beauties have very specialized bees that feed on the pollen there. All of our early spring flowers are specific, almost all of them are have co-evolved with some sort of early emerging adult insect. So there are lots of great choices for springtime flowers. And so now that you've done your keystone species for caterpillars and bees and pollen, now you can decorate to your heart's extent. Okay? So again, this is my North Beach garden, and you might not be able to see that, but that's my map of my backyard in North Beach. I had 212 species of native plants there. So on the trees, I had, a good dozen trees. So, this was a 50 by, my backyard was 50 by 50 feet. So we had a lot of trees in that backyard, including oaks and maples. So it's possible to do this in a small yard. And then, so this was my one little backyard woodland garden that had the oaks. I had winterberry, because North Beach, you're only like 8 inches away from water, so the soil. But this is where I had all kinds of spring ephemerals that would come up here. I had an open sunnier area. There was an oak here and these were viburnums, and that's where I had my more sunny plants. And then I had this random butterfly garden because that's where the milkweed came up, so that's where I put my butterfly garden. I just said the milkweed liked it there, we're going to go. And then I had this garden is this, this garden is this garden here. This was along the edge of our garage where I put sedges. Another good caterpillar food. But this garden is that garden here. So you can do a lot. Like I said, once you've got the pollen and the caterpillars, you can now, like I said, decorate. And now, yes, it's great if you can decorate using, monarch, milkweeds for monarchs. That's a great, accent piece in your garden. My favorite is the spring flowers, and I like the spring flowers and their connection to ants. Ants are like the soil movers of the ecosystems here, not worms, but ants. And ants really depend on the seeds of our spring flowers. And they don't eat the seeds, though. The seeds have this little lipid, dense thing on it called an elaiosome. The ants will collect the seeds, they'll take it down into their burrow, they'll pull up that elaiosome and feed that to their young. The seed can only germinate if that elaiosome is removed. So then the seed, underground, that's where seeds want to be, right? They will then germinate. And so there's this awesome relationship between ants and almost every single one of our spring flowers. So it's really cool. So I like to have that. Mayaples are great if you have a spot where you can just have this lush carpet of the mayaples. Queen bees will come there to get the nectar so they have enough energy to then lay the eggs that they have. But what most people find fascinating is that box turtles love to eat the fruits of mayaples. And so they can help spread that as well. So if you like box turtles, mayaples is a good choice. And then again, just pick your favorites, all right? Because like I said, you put the foundation, so it's fine if you can plant, my husband loves the monardas because they attract the hummingbirds, and I just love columbine, so it's like everywhere in my yard. The hummingbirds like it too, but for me, that's really like that nice little smile I get when I go into my garden. I get to see columbine. And so ultimately, and I think I might actually make it within my hour, is the basic steps. And so I hope that, yeah. And there's clearly lots of different resources out there. So with that, you got questions or comments? Okay, sure.
Can you get the name of the reference book that you've been showing us?
Oh, this is the Flora of Virginia. The Flora of Virginia. It's I think I bought it. I bought it. I was one of the early funders of that introduced this. So I think I got it for about $80. They have an awesome app. The only app I've ever paid for. I think it's $20, and it's basically the book. And you can key out things picture-based, or you can actually key them out with the actual key. So that app is awesome. Flora of Virginia.
Is it published?
Yes, I think it's from 2018. Something like that. Yeah, I don't know what. But yeah, very recent. So, any other questions? Okay, well, thank you, everybody. It's been great. Then I'm going to finish my other favorite books, Reason for a Flower. And this is the book I use out in the field. Plant. Newcomb's Wildflower Guide. So that's what I use out there, besides the 4 Virginia apps.